Thanks everyone for coming to this final session. Good afternoon. Alex, Chris and I are going to do our best to entertain you as we approach the end of the conference and hopefully impart some more useful information. I'm going to talk about the topic of money laundering, or return to the topic of money laundering, which of course we've heard about both a number of times today, but also particularly yesterday. And I'm going to speak about the work that was undertaken by the AIC in collaboration with AUSTRAC to measure the size of the relationship between money laundering and the harm from organised crime. I do want to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge AUSTRAC for their generous financial support of this research. But this isn't just going to be a presentation about money laundering. You've already heard from Ella and Edward, who shared some excellent examples of how big data sets have been created and shared to answer some really important questions about organised crime. And you of course heard also from the ITEC yesterday, talking about how they use data from a range of sources to better measure the illicit tobacco market. And of course several other speakers have also talked about the value of the data that they were analysing. And I hope this presentation will convince you even more of the foundational policy and law enforcement questions that can be answered when novel data are made available for research. I don't feel like this should be a hard sell to the group. I think you're all here hopefully willingly to hear about organised crime research, but I genuinely believe it's going to become increasingly difficult for us to answer some of your most pressing policy questions without access to large linked intelligence datasets for applied organised crime research. But let me start with kind of the background to our research. So when we talk about organised crime, we typically, at its most basic level, we separate it into what we call primary and secondary activities. Those primary activities are the things that we typically associate with organised crime and generating profit. So illicit drug trafficking, human trafficking, fraud, cybercrime, and so on. And secondary activities are those activities that assist with the commission of profit-making crimes or protect the individuals and their profits. These include obviously corruption, money laundering, and the use of violence, technology, and obviously the involvement of professional facilitators. And we've largely accepted, I've used this slide before, we've largely accepted that these enablers are important and that targeting the enablers of organised crime may be a more effective way of disrupting the activities of organised crime groups because it can affect multiple groups or it can affect different illicit markets. But how much of the difference do these secondary activities actually make? Despite the claims, the empirical evidence for many of these is largely limited, partly because of the clandestine nature of organised crime, but also because the research can be quite difficult to do. Now, I think it was Jamie Ferrell yesterday who said that all of the crime problems we were talking about across the 2 days were linked by a common thread, and that thread was money laundering. And of course, I agree with her on this point. Money laundering is obviously an important enabler of organised crime. And I think you'd all look at me strangely if I said the purpose of our research was to try and determine whether there was in fact a relationship between money laundering and organised crime. But the question we actually tried to answer was exactly how much of a difference does money laundering make to the harm caused by organised crime? And perhaps even more importantly, how much harm could we prevent if we stopped or at least reduced the amount of money laundering activity? So the work that I'm talking about today actually started back in 2021 when a colleague, Alicia Schmidt, undertook an exploratory and feasibility study into the impacts of money laundering and terrorism financing. So she embarked on a fairly large-scale desktop review and interviews with subject matter experts, concluding there were 18 harms, or in some cases benefits, associated with money laundering and terrorism financing and the AML-CTF regime. And as well as assessing the presence of these impacts, she also assessed whether they were likely to be significant and relevant to the Australian context, and also whether it would be possible for us to actually try and quantify some of these impacts. And she concluded that there were 4 that were relevant, significant, and which we had some prospect of actually quantifying. These were the impact on serious and organised crimes, the loss of public revenue, obviously by tax that was not able to be claimed from illegitimate proceeds, artificial price increases, particularly in the real estate market, and the negative impact on the reputation of the financial sector of being implicated in money laundering. And each of these have been, to varying degrees, the focus of money laundering research in particular. But we actually didn't have great data or research on the size of the relationship between money laundering and organised crime. And that's what we set about trying to measure as part of this particular study. And to do this, we linked two datasets. The first was the National Criminal Target List, managed by the ACIC. This list, which has now been decommissioned, comprised information on organised crime groups that had been identified by law enforcement as posing a threat to Australia. And it was based on the information provided by law enforcement agencies nationally. We've already used this data for a number of research projects, including our own analysis of criminal careers. This was the source of the work that Edward referred to earlier. And so as part of this work, we'd already linked the NCTL with the National Police Reference System to obtain the recorded offence histories of the individual members of the organised crime groups on the NCTL. What we did, though, as part of this project was we linked that data with data from AUSTRAC on suspicious matter reports. So these are reports that have been submitted by regulated entities relating to suspicious transactions involving people who were named on the NCTL. And this was, for the purpose of this study, our measure of money laundering activity. We were focused on suspicious transactions, both the presence of those transactions but also the volume of those transactions. Now, as I said, the NCTL has since been decommissioned, and some of you in this room will likely be familiar with the system or the list and some of its limitations. But what it offered, though, was a fairly large list of organised crime groups known to law enforcement that wasn't available from any other data source, and it was independent of the data that we'd sourced from AUSTRAC. Now, we're not necessarily interested in understanding what's happening in relation to money laundering activity right now. What we were focused on was trying to understand the relationship between money laundering and organised crime. Whether the strength of the relationship that we observed is still current and relevant is something we can, of course, debate. What we ended up with after this matching process was more than 7,000 suspected members of organised crime groups who had been added to the NCTL and who were organised in close to 900 organised crime groups. Sorry, 7,000 suspected group members in 900 organised crime groups. And there were nearly 9,000 unique suspicious matter reports linked to more than 2,000 of those individuals. And many of those individuals who had at least one suspicious matter report linked to them had multiple suspicious matter reports linked to them. What this means is that for every 100 individuals on the NCTL, there were 29 with a linked SMR between 2014 and 2021, which is the period of data that we had from AUSTRAC. So it's just a fancy way of saying nearly 1/3 of suspected organised crime group members were named in a suspicious transaction over the observation period. Now, we couldn't just use the data over this time period, and I included this slide because of some commentary by Anton yesterday. And you might recall his triangle of regulatory compliance. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but that's what I'm calling it. And he talked about or distinguished between non-compliance from tick box compliance and purposive compliance. Is that the right word? Is that how you say it? I don't know. Look, and what happened is, in the middle of our observation period, AUSTRAC took some very well publicised regulatory action against the Commonwealth Bank for failing to comply with their money laundering obligations. And this was followed soon by action against Westpac and others. And as you can see, that led to a fairly sharp increase in the number of SMRs that were linked to individuals on the NCTL. And that was almost certainly, at least partly, a function of what might be described as tick box compliance. It was a response to that regulatory enforcement. And now the reason that's significant is you're going to hear from me talking, or when I talk about the study that we're doing, we're going to focus on that earlier period, which we feel is a more accurate representation of truly suspicious financial transactions. The other thing I want to point out, and before I get too far into the analysis, is that we looked at the data in the other direction, meaning we took all of the SMRs that have been reported in one financial year and we tried to measure how often they identified someone that was on the National Criminal Target List. And the individuals who are on the NCTL accounted for less than 1% of all SMRs during that period. Now, it's probable that people on the NCTL were the people we're most concerned about. They're most active in terms of organised crime and perhaps causing the greatest harm. But I think this says something really important about the value of financial intelligence in detecting suspicious criminal activity and financial activity that might not otherwise have come to law enforcement attention. So we had data on nearly 900 groups, as I said, and the criminal histories of more than 7,000 individuals and their suspicious financial transactions. And we had both cross-sectional and panel data. We had information about what police knew about these groups, including their criminal activity and composition, the crimes they'd committed, and the suspicious transaction they'd made at around the same time as they'd been added to the NCTL. And we're able to start to use this information to better understand the groups and their money laundering behaviour. So nearly 3/4 of the groups, you hear this figure often quoted by ACRC, had a presence or connection with at least one overseas country. More than 1 in 5 had infiltrated or exploited at least one sector, particularly the transport sector, and you've already heard about that today as well. And nearly 1/3 had a professional facilitator or a known professional facilitator within their membership. And half of the groups were suspected by law enforcement as being involved in money laundering based on law enforcement intelligence. And again, there were quite a few groups who had an SMR or had an individual who had been linked to a suspicious transaction who were not flagged by law enforcement as being involved in money laundering, which again, I think really reinforces the importance of the financial intelligence. We were mostly focused on our groups as our primary unit of analysis. So we kind of were focused at the group level. And the majority of groups in our sample were linked to at least one SMR in the period we were interested in. And there were, on average, 4 suspicious matter reports relating to suspicious transactions with at least, per group with at least one SMR. So they were highly concentrated. And these groups had suspicious transactions that were an average of about $250,000 per member. We did it per member because we wanted to obviously account for the various variable group membership. Now, the median value was much lower at around $30,000, which tells you there was a high degree of variation in the total value of those suspicious transactions. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but I think it's just important to keep these figures in mind as I'm talking through some of our results. Now, one of the things that we observed was that the median value of suspicious transactions per group member varied by the characteristics of each group. So those groups with 2 or more professional facilitators, those groups that were laundering through the real estate market, and those groups that were laundering through gambling services were all responsible for laundering significantly larger amounts of money. Now, that's significant because in one of our other studies on the enablers of illicit drug trafficking, we showed that these same groups are the ones that have a much higher probability of trafficking multiple drug types. And these groups, as we know from David Bright's earlier work, are much more profitable, they're more resilient to disruption, as I'm about to also show you, much more harmful. Now, granted this data is from several years ago, but I think it's worth pointing out that real estate remains a very high and stable laundering channel according to the 2024 National Risk Assessment, while casinos also remained one of the highest risk sectors. So these findings clearly remain relevant. But I want to return to our primary question, which is how much does money laundering increase the harm from organised crime? I'm not going to go into a huge amount of methodological detail here. It's far too late in the conference for me to talk about our 2-way fixed effects models and how we specified those regression models, and I think you'd all completely glaze over. But what I want you to know is that there were 3 parts to our analysis. First, we looked at whether groups that were laundering more money were responsible for more crime harm. Second, we measured whether the amount of crime harm increased when a group launders money or when it launders more money than it did before. That's our panel data analysis. And third, we considered lag effects to work out whether money laundering preceded crime harm, which means the money was laundered and then reinvested in future criminal enterprise, or whether crime preceded money laundering, in which case the increase in crime harm would be from the predicate offences that were facilitated by money laundering. I'll come back to that point and explain the significance of that particular part of the analysis shortly. Now, I keep referring to crime harm, and I think it's worth touching on what I mean. Rather than measuring the total number of offences linked to organised crime groups, we use something called a crime harm index. For those who aren't familiar with this, it's an index where we weight offences by the severity according to sentence outcomes. This is a much better metric because it means we don't count all offences as the same level of seriousness, which of course is important when you're talking about serious offending by organised crime groups. Now, the harm index, as I say to people, means absolutely nothing. The index itself is not a meaningful measure. But what it is a measure of is the relative severity of different crime types, and in our case, the relative severity of crime by different groups and at different points in time. And it's the same metric we used in a number of studies, including looking at escalation in criminal careers, predicting high harm offending by outlaw motorcycle gangs, and also some of Chris Dowling's work around measuring the impact of regulatory approaches to organised crime. Now, of course, in analysing the relationship between money laundering and organised crime, we also had to try and isolate the independent effect of money laundering. We had to try and isolate that from other potential influences. And we did that by controlling for a number of enabling factors, which I referred to earlier, which our study had identified certain factors or group characteristics that were associated with increased harm from illicit drug trafficking. We also had to control for an enforcement effect. We did this in two ways. First, based on whether law enforcement agencies had indicated in their submission to the NCTL that they had investigated the organised crime group, and also the date at which that group had been added to the NCTL. And if we didn't do this, we couldn't be sure that the increase in crime harm coinciding with SMRs, suspicious transactions, wasn't because police happened to be investigating the crime group on the basis of financial intelligence. So it was really important that we accounted for both those other confounding variables, but also the potential for a law enforcement effect. So what did we find? First, organised crime groups involved in money laundering were 1.7 times as likely, this is looking at a cross-sectional relationship, 1.7 times as likely to have a recorded crime or recorded organised crime offence compared to those groups that were not directly involved in money laundering. This included drug supply, blackmail and extortion, serious fraud and other crimes that we define as organised crime, but it was largely drug supply because that was the majority of the groups on the NCTL at the time. Second, when we compared groups, organised crime groups involved in money laundering were responsible for 2.5 times as much crime harm as those groups that were not involved in money laundering. That's again looking at a cross-sectional relationship. Third, and most importantly, when we used a two-way fixed, I did say I wouldn't mention it, but I'm going to mention it, two-way fixed effects model to try and estimate a causal and isolate a causal relationship, we find that when an organised crime group was involved in money laundering, the amount of crime harm they caused increased by 49% from what it would have been had they not been laundering money at that time. That's probably the most important figure, and I want you to remember that because I'm going to come back to that shortly. And fourth, the probability of organised crime offending and the amount of crime harm increased with each additional dollar invested. So it wasn't just whether they were laundering money or not, the harm and the probability of organised crime increased with every additional dollar that they were laundering. And specifically, when the amount of money laundered was doubled, or money laundered by a group doubled from the mean, the amount of recorded crime harm was 3.5% higher than expected. Now that doesn't sound like a big difference, right? I get that. But keep in mind that the mean value was just $50,000 in our sample, $50,000 per member, and the maximum value was as high as $4 million per member. So it was a large variation. So the highest harm, or the groups that were laundering the largest amount of money, were causing significantly more crime harm. Now finally, we were able to establish the direction of the relationship and provide further evidence of a causal relationship by examining lagged effects. Now, what I mean by this is we first tested whether laundering money increased the amount of crime harm in the year that followed, or whether the amount of crime harm in 1 year increased the amount of money that was laundered in the year that followed. So it's basically looking at year one relationship and the year that follows. What we showed is that were lagged effects, but only working in one direction. The amount of money laundered in 1 year, based on the total value of suspicious transaction reports, was associated with an increase in the rate of organised crime the following year. So it was about, basically the money laundering came first, to summarise. Now, I want to briefly summarise the research and then talk about a couple of implications from some of this work. So, first of all, financial intelligence clearly provides important insights into the dark figure of organised crime. It captures an enormous amount of potential organised crime activity that might be missed by other forms of intelligence gathering. Our research also shows and confirms, I think, that serious and organised crime groups laundered more money through vectors and sectors with known vulnerabilities. And I think it's important to say that, of course, many of these vulnerabilities are the focus of the current tranche 2 regulatory reforms that are currently being introduced. We have shown that both the presence and an increase in the amount of money being laundered increase the probability of organised crime and the amount of crime-related harm to the community. And not only that, we could show the size of this increase. We could quantify it. And finally, we showed that an increase in money laundering preceded an increase in crime harm. suggesting that the relationship was due to the reinvestment of illicit funds in future criminal enterprises. And I think this last point is the point that I really want to emphasise. I think it's a really important point. And I want to put this figure in context. You're going to hear from Alex shortly. Hopefully I've not just duplicated your slide, Alex, but hopefully not. You're going to hear a talk shortly about our what is now an annual estimate of the cost of serious and organised crime, which in 23-24 we estimated to be up to $82 billion. Not all of this figure represents the actual proceeds of crime to organised crime groups, but we can use this figure to estimate the total proceeds of crime. And we estimated that to be up to $38 billion in 2023-24. That includes the domestic proceeds from serious and organised crimes, direct serious and organised crimes, from the enablers of organised crime, and also from consequential crime activity. And it reflects the total amount of money that can be, or the total amount of funds that are available for laundering in Australia. It's the total amount that can be laundered and potentially reinvested in future criminal activity. And the amount of future crime harm generated by this sum of money being reinvested is based on the results of our study likely to be significant. And it's why organised crime is such a persistent and wicked problem. But I do want to emphasise, I think there's some room for optimism. So having established a causal relationship, or as close to we can as establish as a causal relationship from a study such as this, including the temporal order of that relationship, we can say with some confidence that if an organised crime group causes more harm when they launder money than when they don't, preventing them from laundering money will reduce future crime harm. And in fact, we can use our results to estimate the size of this potential reduction. Preventing an organised crime from laundering any money will reduce the amount of future crime harm by that group by around 33%, according to the results of our study. And halving the amount of money laundered by that group, or a group that continues to launder money, will reduce the amount of future crime harm by 3.3%. And this is the potential benefit of the work that many of you in this room are already actively involved in. Disrupting money laundering efforts and seizing the illicit proceeds of organised crime is likely to have a demonstrable effect on future organised crime. And I want to give you an example of this. So we recently assisted the team that was in the Attorney General's Department, they're now in Home Affairs, with some modelling as part of their impact analysis to support the forthcoming tranche 2 regulatory reforms. And what we did is we used the outcomes of this AIC research and we showed that even if the reforms are only moderately effective at preventing some of the money being laundered through the currently unregulated entities, so real estate agents, accountants and lawyers, it could be possible to reduce the annual cost from illicit drug activity by as much as $61 million, and that was our conservative estimate. And over 10 years, that would add to closer to $400 million. And again, that's only if those reforms were moderately effective. We took a very conservative approach to this. So you can read this research and the modelling in the published version of the reports. They're all freely available on the AIC website. I think the regulatory report might be on the Premier and Cabinet website, but if you can't find a link, let me know. But what I want to end on is the point I was making at the beginning of this presentation. I was initially worried it sounded a bit self-indulgent or self-serving, but I think everyone's made this point, so I'm going to make it anyway. And I think Alex will confirm, as really the AIC's only dedicated serious and organised crime researcher, that we're not in need of new projects at the moment ourselves. But if you look at the work presented by our two excellent keynotes across at this conference, and in many of the other presentations across these 2 days, the benefit of access to sensitive intelligence and other novel data for research should be clear. And our ability to answer some of the foundational questions and some of the questions you've been asking about wicked organised crime problems depends on access to these data. And if I could leave you with a call to action when you return to your organisation, it's to think about the data held by your agencies, the expertise, and I can't emphasise enough, the expertise that rests in your agencies, both in terms of understanding the operational environment, but also the value and the interpretation of that data, and the questions you want answered, and think about the ways in which these data might be used to help solve some really complex organised crime problems. Thank you very much.